Welcome to the Insight Meditation community of Charlottesville, Virginia. You can find all of our program offerings and information about our Sangha at www.imeditation.org. We meet weekly on Tuesday evenings at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, currently on the Zoom platform for meditation and a Dharma talk given by one of our teachers. We also meet daily at noon Eastern Time on Zoom for sitting practice. We hope you can join us.
And I'd like to start by just lighting a candle. Honoring our presence here, honoring the light and the goodness of all of the beings who have carried the teachings to us over the years. Thank you. And honoring the Monacan nation on whose land we reside. Many ancestors who have, in one way or another, given us the opportunity to be alive and to be here on this land in this presence with these teachings. None of us can do this, of course, alone. So many blessings. And now you might just take a moment and just look to see who's here. You know, kind of scroll through the gallery. Hi, everybody. See everybody's faces. Anyone here for the first time? Brand new? So here we all are. I want to make one other clarification. The title of my talk got a little garbled in the newsletter. And the actual title of my talk is On Being Not, parenthesis, good, close parenthesis, enough. So it's on being not enough. And what we tend to think of it as on being not good enough. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later. But on being not enough. So as we maybe we'll just start with the meditation. I'll offer a few words of guidance on being not enough, and mostly will be in silence. We'll see how this manages on my iPad. So as always, our practice is about tuning into being, on being. How is being for you here tonight? How is this body being? What do you notice? How are these emotions right here, right now? And how is the thinking mind? What do you notice? And you might look to see if that thinking mind has an opinion about how things should be. Our thinking minds often do. You know, that if somehow this were just tweaked just a little bit different, it would be better. So, insofar as it's possible, we might see if we can release at least a bit that sense of should, if there is any there, that sense that it's not quite right. Is it possible to release that even a bit? Ajahn Suchito, remember, talks about gentling ourselves out of a struggle with ourselves, including gentling ourselves out of a struggle with how well we should do with gentling ourselves out of the struggle. It's like this now. Might it, in this body, these emotions, this mind, even just a little bit, be enough? This is how it is. And you might practice with letting there be a specific focus, maybe a sensation, a place of sensation in the body, or places of sensation in the body, maybe the breath. Resting in a simple and gentle and kind awareness. It's like this now, this breath, this particular breath. And we can allow ourselves to experiment, of course, with breathing. But if we notice that there's some tension, some struggle, some sense that we have to fix our breathing somehow, then the invitation is to release that struggle. Just dancing with some wise effort, that we bring effort to focus, let's say, on our breathing. So there's wise effort, but releasing struggle. What would that be like? on being enough. One of the other ways that we can judge ourselves as not enough is when the mind wanders. We find ourselves lost in the past or the future, lost in some kind of thinking. And here the invitation is to make a distinction between discernment, seeing that, and struggling with it, judging it. So seeing it is of value because our practice, our practice is about letting ourselves learn to stay present with our experience. So that's our practice. And to let go when we find ourselves wandering out of presence, out of this moment. So it's an interesting bit of discernment that's required to see the wandering mind and then to discern, well, what's my intention here? What am I doing? And to give permission gently and kindly to simply pause and come back. It's enough to do that. May all sentient beings, boundless as the sky, may all beings in every direction have happiness and the causes of happiness. May we be liberated from suffering and the causes of suffering. May we never be separated from the happiness that is free from sorrow. May we each rest in equanimity, free from ignorance, free from greed, free from aversion and hatred. May all beings be well. Okay, here we are. So a few weeks ago, I invited you to offer some thoughts about what kinds of talks you would like. And one of the talks that you were interested in is on working with the critical voice, the self-critical voice. So I thought I would do that tonight. And by the way, as you know, many of you know, I love it. I love it. I love it. Thank you. Thank you. When you offer suggestions or you raise questions, it's just a lovely way of sharing and creating the evening together. So keep those cards and letters coming. Great. So the title I came up with is on not being good enough. Not being good enough. And I put the word good in parenthesis on not being enough. So that's what we'll play with a little bit tonight, not being good enough. I'll start with a quote here, with a couple side comments from yours truly during the quote. This is a quote from Trungpa Rinpoche. And he says, meditation practice is not an exotic or out of reach approach. And I would add, it's also not a mental or conceptual approach. While it's important to understand the teachings, that alone will get you nowhere. That alone will get you nowhere. Well, maybe to an inflated ego about how smart you are and how much you know. It might get you there. That was Sharon. Now, back to Trungpa. He says, meditation practice is not an exotic or out of reach approach. It is immediate and personal. And it involves an intimate relationship with ourselves, getting to know ourselves by examining our actual experience. This is not me, this is Trungpa, without being ashamed of it. So he says it involves an intimate relationship with ourselves, getting to know ourselves by examining our actual experience without being ashamed of it. And in the follow-up notes that I'll give to Judy, I will give you the source for. There's a nice Lion's Roar article that you can take a look at. So he says, by examining our actual experience. And so our meditation practices, is looking at, so what is our actual experience? What's happening? What's happening out there in the world, out there? What's happening in here? What's happening in our own direct experience? Just a little side note, many of you know I teach insight dialogue, and insight dialogue is a practice of speaking not from concept, but from directly from our own experience. It's not really a practice of relationship, and it's not a practice of speech. It's a practice of knowing our experience and then speaking that into the relationship. In my teacher John Wellwood's words, bringing unconditional presence to our experience. So if we ask ourselves, or if I ask you, what's going on for you right now? What is your experience right now? Your first response very likely will be something like, I don't know. I don't know really what it is. Mhm. And then the second response is very likely to be some kind of concept, like, I'm tired, or something like that. But our meditation practice invites us to look even deeper, more deeply into the direct, like in this case, let's say I'm tired. Well, what are the sensations in the body that my mind puts all together into this concept of, oh, this is what it feels like to be tired? So what's going on, not so much in my mind, but what's going on directly in the somatic bodily sensory experience of this moment? And again, when we start to look, it's not wrong. It's actually a kind of a good signal when we start to look and we actually don't know. Um, but we very quickly come to a challenge because we can notice, either consciously or unconsciously, that we don't really want to know. You don't really want to know. And it's true for all of us. David White talks about this place as the frontier, that place where we kind of, just what you're saying, when you say, oh, I'm tired, I don't really want to look any further than this. Just what you're saying, the cocoon. Linda, you talked about the cocoon, this place. And David White, the poet David White, he talks about it as a frontier. He says this foreign, unexplored land between what we are comfortable with, what we are familiar with, and what we want to be true, and how it is. And he calls it a frontier, Uh, he calls it a conversation, that we're invited into this conversation right at that edge of what we're comfortable with, and where, this, if you will, this territory where we're not at all sure we want to go. And so our meditation practice is a practice. We often can get the meditation part, but we forget about the practice part. Remember, I've said this quote many times lately, Ajahn Chah's quote. He says, not to imagine that in our own practice, he says, don't imagine that you have a big tractor trailer when what you have is a wheelbarrow. The capacity to be at the frontier, and the capacity at any particular time. And when difficult things arise, either externally or internally, and most often and I'm talking about Sharon here, have just a rickety little wheelbarrow. When difficult things arise, and the difficulty can be anything. It can be something that's really unpleasant, but it also can be the ending of something pleasant. When difficult things arise, sometimes we can find ourselves with just a rickety little wheelbarrow, to switch metaphors from David White's metaphor of the frontier. Mm. This place where we kind of meet the edge of the unknown and we're not sure we really want to go there. Mm. So our practice is about having curiosity about our actual experience. Let me pause there for a second and see what time it is. I'm also aware, as usual, that I may not finish tonight. And so rather than trying to push through, and I also want to hear what you all have to say, that this may end up being a two-part talk, probably will. And even the fighting and resistance, even the place where we resist, that too is part of our experience, isn't it? So we can see how easy it is to form some kind of concept about how our practice should go if we were doing it properly, or how I should be if I were, something, I don't know, fill in the blank. So that even the resistance, even the fighting, even the confusion, that is our experience. And one of the ways that we try to avoid our direct experience, there are many ways. Some of you have named them: chocolate chips, whatever. There are many ways we try to avoid our direct experience, but one of them is through criticism. I, you, she, he, they should be otherwise. We can do it to ourselves, we can do it with others. I, you, he, she, they should be other than you are right now. If you were, I don't know, fill in the blank, a good meditator, a good person, a good something, a good wife, a good partner, a good mother, a good father, a good whatever. I, you, he, she, they should be otherwise. And so we can watch our minds, in some ways we go, well, that's interesting, but well, yeah. So one of the ways we can try to avoid our direct experience is by way of criticisms. And we are often critical of ourselves to the point where we may even become our own enemies. And for that matter, we can be critical of others to the point where we become the enemies of others. Something should be otherwise. So meditation is a way of ending that quarrel, Trungpa says, by making friends with ourselves. Only then can we truly make friends with others. He says, otherwise we are just pretending. So it's a pretty tall order, no? Making friends with ourselves, making friends with our own experience. And just a note, just as we practice goodwill toward ourselves and others, and your minds may even be going there, it doesn't mean that everything we do is right or wonderful or wholesome or justified or splendid or a great idea. So that distinction there between discernment, seeing what is wholesome and helpful and useful toward the ends, the intentions that we have, discernment is useful. But condemnation and judgment and criticism, not so much. Really important and sometimes a very hard distinction. And the question might be, how does it happen that we, and I will say, especially uniquely in the West, struggle with judgment and our own critical voice so much? You've heard me give you lots of examples of times when Eastern teachers are truly deeply befuddled at our Western tendency to be critical of ourselves. They truly have no idea what we are talking about. So it's a sort of uniquely Western disease. Munindra calls it he says, a new kind of suffering. I didn't know about that. You know, so, and I want to just also put a little footnote here. Well, maybe it's not a footnote. Maybe it's a big billboard. That we need to tread kind of carefully here, because teachings that are useful for some, spiritual teachings that are useful for some, and psychological teachings that are useful for some can be deeply misleading for others, depending on what we are working with. You know? So that brings us back to that place where we have to look at the teachings, deeply understand their intention, and then look to see, with respect to what my experience is, how does this really work? So teachings that are useful for some of us, even here tonight, can be deeply misleading for others. So we want to tread a little carefully, but just contemplate together. So we're called to examine, what is my actual experience here? Not just as a concept, but how is this landing directly in whatever this is, landing directly in my experience? And again, we tend to focus on extremes, either refusing to notice or explore our own, or for that matter, others' intentions, limitations, and confusions. Or, so either we won't explore and or excuse them mindlessly, or we accuse others or ourselves mercilessly. So we tend to kind of whip between those two extremes. So meditation is the middle path, the path of really looking directly at our experience. So from a spiritual perspective, one of my teachers, John Wellwood, talks about just from a spiritual perspective, there are a couple of mistakes we can make. And this is in his book, chapter in his book, Tortoise Psychology of Awakening, and I will give you that reference as well. But John rather famously coined the term spiritual bypassing, in which we use spiritual practices about the absolute realm of experience, to help us ignore or override or condemn our experience in the world of form. So, for example, we can use teachings about loving kindness to help us override what is needed in terms of protecting ourselves and taking care of ourselves. Spiritual bypassing. This is what John says. He says, spiritual practice involves freeing consciousness from its entanglement in form, matter, emotions, personality, and social conditioning. Okay, freeing consciousness from its entanglements. Okay, fair enough. In a society like ours, he says, it is tempting to use spirituality as a way to try to rise above this shaky ground. In this way, spirituality becomes just another way of rejecting one's experience, adopting a rationale based on using absolute truth to deny or disparage relative truth. Absolute truth is what is eternally and universally true, now and forever, beyond any particular viewpoint. Psychological realities represent relative and personal truth. They are relative to particular individuals in particular circumstances. So, by confusing absolute truth and relative truth, and not understanding at which level we need to be working. So again, I'm just saying, so we need to tread carefully here, because we can take the teachings and say, I should be working at the spiritual level, when really what we're dealing with is a psychological issue, an issue, we'll call it Western teachings call it psychological issues, but it's a teaching in the world of form. That it's not a spiritual issue. It's an issue that has to do with the world of form, which Western psychology is better at. And indeed, sometimes Eastern teachers who don't understand Western psychology will teach only absolute truths, but tend to ask us to override the world of form. Similarly, psychologists, people who understand about the world of form, can ignore spiritual realities. Goes in both directions. It can be helpful to remember that that place, that frontier that David White talks about, that it's actually quite hard to be willing to be with our experience. That's true whether you're in the East or the West. The problems, the entanglements that we talk about may be more unique to different cultures. But the difficulty of actually being with experience is universal. And that place where we say, I don't really want to know my experience, is universal. So maybe we can have, some kindness there about that, and know that we're all in good company. We're all in good company there. So thank you. Yeah. And it's true, isn't it? I mean, sometimes our inner critic can be quite brutal. So in the meantime, why don't I just pause there for tonight? That in the meantime, just kind of see if there is any little thread of tonight's talk and tonight's conversation that you might want to contemplate. Maybe you'll contemplate it with more questions, and you can send them to me or just bring them the next time. Maybe what if you contemplated letting yourself notice, for example, that frontier that John White or David White talks about, that frontier, and you talked about contemplating, or you kind of looked at it with a kind of kindness, the way an Eastern parent might look at, a child who was having a little trouble tying their shoes or something. And that you just contemplated the way that it's a little hard to contemplate. So I think we'll stop there. We've got 1 minute left and we're good, and we'll go on. Okay. So thank you. To be continued.